Good evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Clement's in Ewell. Welcome to the wonderful world of the New Testament. And I think it's our 314th step on our walking tour through the Gospel. And through the Bible. And we're going to start with St. Matthew's Gospel, the first book of the New Testament. And with the New Testament, we come into much more familiar territory than we found ourselves in the Old Testament. A lot of the Old Testament is quite hard to get your head around because we know it much less, we read it much less, and of course it's considerably longer. Look, here is my Jerusalem Bible. The fat bit on that side is the Old Testament. The slim bit on this side is the New Testament. New Testament's much, much shorter and therefore much easier to digest and to absorb and to familiarize yourself with. Now, at the time of Jesus, or just after the time of Jesus, when the movement was getting started, when Christians were relatively few and far between in the Roman Empire and beyond the borders of the Roman Empire, maybe in Persia, people were saying, so this Jesus, who is he? Who is this man, Jesus, of whom we have heard tell? And if you knew somebody who might be a Christian, they would pass you a scroll and say, this will tell you, this is St. Matthew's Gospel, and this will fill you in on who this Jesus is. That's the purpose of St. Matthew's Gospel, to tell you who Jesus is. And right at the beginning, it's a pretty obvious point, isn't it? But that is, the basic point. Without that point, you can't really go any further. You've got to accept that point. So Matthew's not a historian and he's not a this, that, and the other. He's somebody who's come to tell you who Jesus is. And the very first page of St. Matthew's Gospel is telling you this Jesus, where did he come from? It's giving you an answer. Nowadays, of course, you're not supposed to say, and where do you come from to people? Because I don't know why, but you're not. In those days, you were allowed to say, where do you come from? Jesus of Nazareth. He came from Nazareth, fine. But this gives us a much longer and involved story of the origins of Jesus. First of all, it gives us his genealogy. So who are you? Whose son are you? Whose grandson are you? Whose great-grandson are you? Who are your ancestors? So Jesus is presented to us with a long string of ancestors, so we'll know exactly who he is. Now, this long string of ancestors, which is the first 16 verses of St. Matthew's Gospel, alerts us to the fact that St. Matthew's Gospel must have been written for a predominantly Jewish audience, because all of Jesus's ancestors are Jewish, and these names would not make any sense to anyone who wasn't familiar with the Old Testament. So it's sort of a bridge between the two. So, for example, Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Well, yes, we know that from reading the Old Testament. That would make perfect sense to a Jew, would make much less sense to a Roman. A Roman wouldn't have cared. A pagan Roman wouldn't have cared. But don't forget, in those days, there were lots of Jews about in the land of Israel, but also many, many more in Egypt and in the rest of the Roman Empire and even in the Persian Empire. Jews were everywhere. And the minority probably were in the land of Israel. And so this points us to another thing, that probably the first spread of the gospel was through Jewish people, but not Jewish people who spoke Hebrew, but in fact, nobody spoke Hebrew in those days. They spoke Aramaic if they spoke a Semitic language, but Jewish people who spoke Greek, because this was written in Greek, and Jewish people who read the Bible in Greek. They read the Septuagint, translation of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, into Greek. And so they'd read about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they knew, this Jesus, he's a Jew just like us. That's presumably the point of telling us that Jesus is descended from Abraham. Jesus is Jewish just as you're Jewish, and therefore he is somebody who commands your attention. Well, the genealogy has a few strange points to it. Do have a look at it because it's well worth going through, because we've met all these people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, Perez, Hezron, Ram, Aminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Azariah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Amon, Josiah, and then the deportation to Babylon took place, Jeconiah, Shealtiel, and Zerubbabel. After that, the names are not mentioned in the Old Testament. Zerubbabel's the last one to be mentioned. The rest, we don't know anything about these people apart from what we're told by St. Matthew. And then down to Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. Of her was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Now, actually, this is the genealogy of St. Joseph. But St. Joseph was the legal father, the adoptive father, but the legal father of Jesus. Therefore, Jesus could legally claim these people as his ancestors. Okay, those are the people. Goodies and baddies abound in this list. So, for example, Jacob was a very dodgy sort of person, I think you will remember. But what about Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, was absolutely appalling and caused the people to revolt. Then you have Amon, who was an idol worshipper. He was absolutely ghastly, king of Judah. But then you've got Josiah, who was an absolute hero of the faith. And you've also got David, the hero of the faith par excellence. And you've got Solomon, the wisest of the wise. So Jesus is the son of David, but he's also the son of Solomon. But also he's a son of Ammon, but we try not to talk about that. He's also the son of Josiah, which is rather good. The other thing is we also have some females brought in here. Okay, it's a man's world. At least it is in the world of the Old Testament and sometimes of the New Testament as well. But we have some females. Now, he only mentions, I think, 4 females, but this is unusual. He mentions Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and then he also mentions Uriah's wife. He doesn't mention her name, Bathsheba. Those 4 females are mentioned. Now, why on earth is this? Jesus is the son of Tamar. He's the son of Rahab. He's the son of Ruth. And he's the son of Bathsheba. Well, they are pretty major figures in the Old Testament. So obviously, if you are related to them, you can't really cover it up. But at the same time, they are rather questionable characters. Well, I mean, there's nothing questionable, I suppose, about Rahab. I mean, she is called Rahab the harlot. And of course, she wasn't even Jewish. She was the one, if you remember, who let the Israelites into the city of Jericho. And when Jericho fell, she and she alone, with her household, was saved. Rahab the harlot. So she was Rahab the sex worker, as we'd say nowadays, and an ancestress of Jesus. And of course, she was the mother of Boaz, the father of Obed, and of course, Obed's mother was Ruth, the Moabitess, the one who actually gets a book of her own in the Old Testament. The thing about Rahab and Ruth is they were both quite canny women. They saw the way things were moving. They made sure they were on the winning side. They had choices and they made the right choice. Now, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but the reader of the book, to whom the scroll has been passed and reads this, he's got a choice. He's presumably Jewish. He or she, actually, probably more likely she, is Jewish. And is thinking, well, this Jesus, should I go with this new Messiah or should I reject him? That's the choice. Rahab knew that the people of Israel were on the up and the people of Jericho were destined to be destroyed, and she jumped ship pretty smartly. Now, that could be seen calculating, that could be seen to be looking out for number one. But when it comes to your eternal salvation, looking out for number one is not a bad idea, In other words, consider your eternal salvation, consider your position, and make the change. Again, the same could be Ruth as well. She was a Moabitess, but she joined the people of Israel. And she became the great mother of the greatest Israelite of all, King David. Then, of course, we've got Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. Well, she didn't stay Uriah's wife for long, did she? She decided because it's all rather mysterious, maybe she decided King David was the man for her. And of course, she used a rather gruesome way of doing it, but she too made a choice. Not she was Uriah's wife, but then she became King David's wife, and then her son became the king. And then, of course, we have Tamar. Tamar's stratagem for having children was quite extraordinary. She seduced her father-in-law, disguised as a cultic prostitute. Please don't try this at home. And the point about that is, again, the calculation. So it's have the wisdom of the serpent, is what this passage is saying to us, I think. Don't let this chance for salvation pass you by. And then it concludes Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and of her was born Jesus, who is called Christ. Now, Christ is not some sort of surname, please. No, it means Jesus, who is called, who is, again, who is called, the one who is justly called, the one who is acclaimed as the Messiah, the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one of God. That's what Christ means. So it's saying, this Jesus, what do you think? Is he the Messiah for you, or are you going to be on the wrong side when the trumpet shall sound, etc.? Do you remember the trumpet sounded outside Jericho? That was a big moment. And again, when the trumpet shall sound and the dead shall be raised, do you want to be with the Christ, or do you not want to be with the Christ? Do you want to be one of the ones let out? Then, of course, St. Matthew has this rather funny little thing that he finishes on verse 17. The sum of generations is therefore 14 from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the Babylonian deportation, and 14 from the Babylonian deportation to Christ, showing a sort of a parallel, if you see what I mean. God had got this all planned out, you see. Let's have 14 generations and another 14 generations, etc. Except it doesn't quite work out like that because he counts several people twice and so on. He wants to show the pattern emerging. And what he's showing, the overall pattern he's showing is emerging, that the history of Israel produced one Messiah only. This is the Messiah that you need to accept if you are to be saved. All the very best. So it's brilliant, 17 verses there, so much in it. All the best. Bye.